From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, the role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in national policy.
I'm Peter Hackus in Washington. Among the many institutions undergoing important changes in recent months has been the nation's military, starting right at the top. The whole shape of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is changing as President Carter's appointees have taken over leadership of the armed services. The role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in directing the military branches, and especially the role of the chairman of this top presidential Pentagon advisory panel, has become a matter for discussion and debate on Capitol Hill and in the armed services themselves. Military officials are said to be strongly divided over some of Mr. Carter's appointments, as they have been over some controversial military decisions by the president. Members of Congress have joined the fray over such items as the scrapping of the B-1 bomber, the Panama Canal Treaty, and the sidetracking of the neutron bomb. In all of this, what should be the role of the Joint Chiefs? How far can they go in criticizing their commander-in-chief, in public or in private? How valuable is their advice to an independent-minded president? Can these top military leaders fulfill their obligation to report to an increasingly independent Congress and still serve the president who appointed them? What is the proper role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs? Should the JCS chairman have more authority to increase his influence over military matters? What are the pros and cons of each JCS member being both the chief of his own military service and a member of the supposedly neutral JCS? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Today's roundtable discussion will examine the role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in national policy. Appearing on the panel are Senator John Culver of Iowa, a Democrat serving his first term following 10 years as a congressman. Senator Culver, a former Marine Corps officer, is a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Culver is the author of a recent essay published in the AEI Defense Review in which he opposed production of the B-1 bomber. Retired Army General Maxwell Taylor, he served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for 2 years in the early 60s. He was U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Vietnam in 1964 and 65, and then became a special consultant to President Johnson until 1969. General Taylor is the author of an essay in the book Grand Strategy for the 1980s, published recently by AEI. Retired Air Force General George Brown, another former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He served in that position for 4 years, following a year as Air Force Chief of Staff. General Brown retired in June 1978, ending a 41-year military career. Dr. Curtis Tarr, former Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance. Dr. Tarr also served for 2 years as head of the Selective Service System, and prior to that, as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. Dr. Tarr is now Vice President of Deere and Company. John Charles Daly will moderate the roundtable discussion. Mr. Daly has served as a news correspondent and analyst for CBS and ABC, and as a vice president of the ABC network. For 2 years, he headed the Voice of America. Now, here's our moderator, Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with the functions and effective utilization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Our subject, the role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in national policy. The Joint Chiefs, the JCS, came into being informally in the pressure cooker of World War II, our Army, Navy, and Air Service chiefs, forming with the already existing British Chiefs of Staff's Committee, the Combined Chiefs of Staff. At home, then, our JCS became the primary agency for the coordination and strategic direction of the Army and Navy under the immediate responsibility of the President as Commander-in-Chief, advising the President on strategy, the requirements, production and shipping, manpower needs, etc. In mid-1942, Admiral William D. Leahy was appointed to a new position, that of Chief of Staff to the President, and joined the JCS as senior and presiding member. The National Security Act of 1947, after the war, formally established the JCS as a permanent agency within the national military establishment and designated its members as the principal military advisors to the President, the National Security Council, and the Secretary of Defense. Since 1947, beginning with what is known as the 1948 Key West Agreement, a 1949 amendment formally creating the office of chairman, 1952 legislation giving the Commandant of the Marine Corps co-equal status when the JCS considered matters directly concerned with the Corps, to the Defense Reorganization Act of 1958, which established operational forces in unified and specified commands responsible to the Secretary of Defense through the JCS. That body has undergone several major changes. Now, 20 years later, the Stedman Report on the JCS, issuing from a task force established by President Carter in 1977, charges that the JCS is playing a limited role in defense policy and is plagued by procedures that inhibit initiative and need major overhaul. The report urges the chairman of the JCS to be given more power and, quote, act from his own national perspective and not on behalf of the individual services in advising the President and the Secretary of Defense on spending and military issues. And so, General Taylor, as a former chairman of the JCS, do you think that the stature and influence of the JCS needs upgrading?
That's very hard to answer. Very few people are in a position to, one, to measure the stature of any institution like the Joint Chiefs, and secondly, what level in the public eye the institution is regarded by, generally speaking. It requires a great deal of knowledge of what the functions of the Joint Chiefs are, what they're responsible for, what they're supposed to do, and I would hope this discussion tonight will bear on that subject and illuminate it.
All right, Dr. Tarr, as one who has served as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, Director of the Selective Service System, Under Secretary of State for Security Assistance, do you feel that our highest military body has functioned as effectively as it can and should under the present system?
John, I think that the people of the nation have been well served by particularly able and dedicated people on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I think there's no question, however, that through the years, the authority of the Joint Chiefs has been eroded to the disadvantage of the nation. There have been a lot of proposals about how that body might be restructured. My own personal feeling is that the challenge is not so much to reorganize, but to work within the flexibility that is present in the system.
General Brown, you retired at mid-year as Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff after more than 40 years of active duty. Are you satisfied in this very recent experience that the JCS played its full and proper role in decisions in things like the B-1 strategic bomber, the Panama Canal treaties, the neutron bomb, and, for instance, the ongoing SALT II negotiations?
Well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have, I think, functioned as the Commander-in-Chief wished that they were to function. And I served three, President Nixon, President Ford, and President Carter. And under each, there was some difference in what was wanted of the chiefs within the law and within the formal responsibilities of the chiefs. As I mentioned earlier, I think the key to the thing is whether the chiefs have fulfilled their responsibilities in providing advice, and in my time, I must say they did, whether asked or not. And the key, again, is whether the advice was accepted.
Right, Senator Culver, as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, serving on the Manpower and Personnel and the Research and Development subcommittees, how do you feel the Congress assesses the present role of the JCS?
Well, I think that the Congress is extremely respectful and admiring of the professional dedication that has characterized the quality of service chiefs that we've had, and certainly the chairman, historically. I think they also have enormous respect for the extent to which there's been a very careful observance and adherence to civilian control in a general sense in accordance with our political system and process. I think if there's shortcomings as perceived by the Congress toward the work product of the chiefs, it perhaps comes as a result of the difficulty they have under their present organizational structure in simultaneously wearing two hats and fulfilling the responsibility on the one hand to be an advisor to the president and when solicited by the Congress provide unfettered military advice of a national nature on defense and security questions, and at the same time be advocates for their respective services. And I think that one of the consequences of this is that it oftentimes, in my judgment, results in wish lists being prepared by the various services, and the differences being papered over. And in order to achieve a watered-down consensus, there necessarily is log rolling and back scratching, which results in, I think, a certain lack of realism by way of fiscal and budgetary considerations. So finally, I think that we in Congress desperately need military judgments and recommendations from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and from the chiefs themselves that's based on priorities and comparative risks in order so we can make informed judgments in either cutting or adding to a budget, and we need this free from service bias.
Yes, please, General Brown.
One point, Senator Culver, I've heard you express this view before. I understand it, but I think it's of some note and worthy of noting here that while the JCS do come in with what you refer to as wish list, a force structure requirement that exceeds realistic physical terms, perhaps it is less than the sum of what the commanders-in-chiefs of the several forces around the world feel they need.
All right, General Taylor, you did say initially that you hoped we would part under this dialogue from a basic knowledge of how the JCS was structured and formed. Would you give us your thoughts on how it has operated and those elements of it which you think should be part of this discussion?
Well, that's quite an order. Let me just mention a few things so that we're all talking about from the same base. Bear in mind the Joint Chiefs have two functions, one which is specified by law to be the principal military advisors, with an S, bear in mind, to the President, the National Security Council, and the Secretary of Defense. The other is based on regulation to serve the Secretary of Defense as a military operational staff, through which, as you mentioned, he issues his orders to the commanders-in-chief, and through which war would be conducted. Those are quite distinct functions. Now, over the years, the question is, the same terms of dissatisfaction which we're hearing tonight have been repeated over and over again. It boils down to three different formats. One, the situation more or less is now where you have a committee performing both of these functions. Or you could take a committee to perform the advisory function and separate out the operational function to a chief of staff to the Secretary of Defense. Or you could have some, or in the final, you could take the Joint Chiefs of Staff away completely and have that man on horseback, which is the bugbear that we're always threatened with, simply as the Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Defense, a relationship which is quite common in Western powers. So those three variants have been before us. Now, I think we should perhaps relate our thoughts, at least, to those three possibilities. starting off with the committee. And at this point, let me say, all committees are bad. The bigger they are, the worse they are. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff, being a committee, has a lot of things to account for.
Well, on the point that you made, can we go back to something noted earlier, which is that informally the JCS came into being to represent our services on the combined chiefs of staff, and then, as it was noted, 7 months after we got into World War I, World War II, sorry. Well, see, I'm much older than you are, Doctor. 7 months after, President Roosevelt appointed Admiral Leahy as his chief of staff and declared him to be the senior and presiding officer. Now, you had noted a moment ago a chief of staff to the Secretary of Defense. Do you find that as satisfactory as you would a chief of staff appointed by the president to act for him and not be as a member of a committee?
That is not an easy answer, again, because it depends on how you view the function of the Secretary of Defense. Is he going to be anything more than the head man who forms together the resources of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in the United States for use abroad? One concept, perfectly valid if you take that. Now he's also in the channel of command. Bear in mind, President Roosevelt wanted it the way he did it. He didn't deal through any civilian. He dealt directly first to General Marshall and Admiral King, and then Admiral Leahy came in the trio. Really, everything went from the president to him. I think history will say that worked pretty well as long as the president was in good health, but it worked quite badly toward the end. It's certainly not a format which I personally would recommend for today. But those are just indicates the varying solutions that have appeared over the years. And the one that works is the one that works best with that particular president. As George has said, every president is different. You can't change presidents. You have to adapt to the president if you're going to.
Senator Culver, you know, the historic concern in our country about the subordination of the military to the civilian. In the Stedman report, where there is a plea for greater power for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a commitment really to give it a better stature and a wider scope of use. Are you concerned with the Stedman report's recommendations?
Well, I read the Stedman report. I don't interpret it as being all that substantially different than the kind of debate, as General Taylor properly observes, that's taken place for the last 30 years on this subject, because it's really variations on the same theme. And Mr. Stedman suggests, it was really more the newspaper characterization, I think, that talked about giving the the chairman more power and so forth, with the clear implication being that there would somehow be more of a decisive determination of security policy or something. I didn't think the equation was at all altered in terms of the relative relationship with civilian authority.
General Brown?
I would just like to say that without disagreeing with much of what Senator Culver said, not much has changed in fact by what Dick Stedman recommends. Right. The things he would have the chairman do, Secretary Harold Brown had me doing since the change of administration. The big difference is that I was not provided any staff help. Therefore, I had to sit at the table with the people on these very important programmatic and weapon systems problems and draw on things I knew before I ever got the job. And I had no staff help. Now, Stedman would have authorized some staff for the chairman for these functions, and I think that'd be a big help. The rest of it, I think most of it's gone on. I know for my own part, and I'm sure people ahead of me tried to be the link between the commanders-in-chief in the field and the Secretary of Defense and the structure there, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it worked. It worked through just because we were people who could get along. We were working at the same task. We had the same basic aims. Now, to try and do it because you have the authority to do it, you're still going to have to do it the same way, or it isn't going to work.
Dr. Tarr?
George, I think there is one difference, though. One of the strengths in the World War II organization was that the Joint Chiefs met and decided militarily what they do, and they'd get the concurrence of the President. And then the chiefs of the services would pass the orders to their field people, who would then carry them out. The danger now, where you don't institutionalize the chain of command, it seems to me, is that at some point, a new group of civilians can come in and the command channel can get very fuzzy. And I think there have been times since 1958 when they were.
General Taylor?
It worries me, though, when I read in this report we're discussing having the chairman get deeply into the budget process. You can ruin the utility of this fellow if you ask too much of him. And when I see him getting into the numbers racket, I worry about it.
Well, now, the Stedman report expresses a general degree of satisfaction with the military guidance that has been offered by the Joint Chiefs, but rather makes a point of the fact that the formal position papers, in effect the institutional product, Doctor, that you talked about, are almost uniformly given low marks by their consumers in the State Department, the Defense Department, and the Security Council. Now, you served in a broad spectrum of perspectives. What has been the attitude or reaction of recipients of JCS advice, as you know it, the President, the National Security Council, Secretary of Defense? Have they sought advice eagerly or reluctantly? Do they usually follow, ignore, or reject it? Or do they welcome volunteered advice?
I think the problem when you ask a committee to draft something, it doesn't come out in lucid, forceful English, and that's just what you get used to. But as far as the quality of advice is concerned, I don't really think that's the problem. I think the place where you're going to receive the most watered-down advice is where you try to put the Joint Chiefs into an assignment where they have to try to allocate resources. Now, a lot of people talk about the allocation of resources from the standpoint that this is just simply because people are biased by their previous background. And each of these people is bound to emphasize the quality of weapon systems and people trained to do certain jobs with which they're most familiar. I don't think that it's reasonable to expect these people working as hard as they can for national security to put aside their previous experience and say, well, we're going to take an overall military view of this. It just won't work that way. It doesn't work in civilian life that way. We tend to emphasize best the things with which we're most familiar. So if you try to plunge the JCS into resource allocation, you're going to get papers that are late, that are even more turgid, that are even more watered down, that are even less useful. But on military subjects, they won't be well written, but they'll be sound.
I would like to, just for the sake of perhaps stimulating discussion, propose that the quality does suffer from this effort to achieve consensus, to paper over differences between the services and to take care of everybody, which is the natural, we do it every day in Congress. There's no reason the politics are not all that dissimilar. But when we talk about military advice, it seems to me that, for example, when we, in the Congress, the Armed Services Committee, we may be confronted with what is the most appropriate response to the Warsaw Pact threat of Central Europe. Do we want more missile-equipped planes? Do we want more helicopters? Do we want more tanks? Do we want more anti-tank missiles? Or what mix of these things? Now, the normal and natural and understandable propensity of each of the individual services is to say, with a good, commendable, can-do spirit, we can do it with more tanks, or we can do it with more anti-missiles, or we can do it. But to get some, when hard-nosed choices like that are before us, I'm afraid the tendency is to avoid disagreement by agreeing on more for everybody. And when you're talking about working with budgetary constraints and fiscal realism, that really won't work, much less balancing it off against a lot of other considerations. So I would be interested in eliciting from both General Brown and General Taylor, how practical or feasible is it to consider the formal submission of advice in these papers and so forth with a more realistic and vigorous encouragement of pro and con, and more than just footnoting mild dissent, in order to try to get comparative risk and threat and costs and so forth for a civilian decision maker that he can really use and is far more valuable.
General Taylor?
You raise a very important point. During my 4 years as Chief of Staff, there was a great deal of pressure put on the chiefs by way of the Secretary of Defense, which emanated from the White House, not to have split opinions. In other words, don't divide on an issue. Try to get a concurrence. And a split paper was so unhappily received in the upper echelons of this government that then it became the practice to have recourse to the under-the-carpet filing system. And it should laid there like lumps on a log throughout the 4 years I was there. A new administration came in. A different kind of people were in charge. When I became chairman under Secretary McNamara, I had a deal with him that as chairman, I'm not responsible for getting unanimity. I'm responsible for developing the issues. And I will have the pros and cons of split papers as clear in English as possible, because you put your finger on it. The military mind is a pretty damn good mind in terms of defeating the enemy in battle, but it's awfully poor when you put it on paper in a way that the lay intelligent reader, namely the civilian leadership, can understand.
General, the difficulty on some of these things is that nobody knows what the answer is. There's no way they can know what the answer is.
You can't. Certainly, if you ask how to defend Europe in a two-page report, you can't do it, of course. And furthermore, when we get to Congress, I think you'll concede, Senator, immediately they get out, how many tanks do you need? You want numbers at least to fill in. And an honest man will say, I haven't the foggiest idea at that time.
General Brown?
The only thing I could add is that one innovation that has been helpful in this regard, and I must agree that with what Senator Culver charges us, that there is a tendency to come up with more for everybody as a solution. But that is to rely more and more on the field commander, General Haig in Europe. Now, he's got the same problem in that theater that the chiefs have. In other words, he's got to be concerned with his naval support, his air support, the land battle, and what he needs, what mix of hardware on the ground, and so on. Most of the issues that are split today go to force structure issues for the very reason that you put your finger on. And I think it will always be thus. And I don't know that having the chairman with a small staff of mixed uniforms is going to provide a solution. It'll provide another voice, which hopefully will be helpful. But ultimately, it's going to be thrashed out in the National Security Council structure and before the Congress, in my opinion.
Senator Culver, each president uses the National Security Council in a different and very personal way. Some have used it as an after-the-fact confirming body, perhaps precluding any timely advice to the Security Council from the JCS. Some presidents have relied exclusively on a very small, close group of personal civilian advisors, some cabinet members and others not. Under such circumstances, advice from the JCS is, in a sense, simply excluded. Now, does this violate the intent of the Congress in creating the law? And are there any remedies to the situation if it does?
You can have presidents that completely ignore the cabinet, completely ignore the NSC, completely ignore the Congress, completely ignore everybody but their poker buddies. And if that's their choice, that's where they're getting the advice. Now, ideally, you do try to structure a system that, at least by way of its organizational nature, is most likely to ensure if properly functioning, the presentation of all the appropriate information and options and relevant judgments from the experts within the government so that the president can make the most informed and proper decision. But whether or not he or eventually perhaps even she wants to ignore that counsel or to completely reject the entire process, that'll always remain a prerogative of the President of the United States.
Gentlemen, President Kennedy, I believe after the Bay of Pigs episode, directed that the JCS take political considerations into account in their thinking and stated that he wanted them to do more than just give military advice. Now, do you agree with that, or do you feel that the JCS should limit their advice to strictly military matters? General Taylor?
I agree with it very much. I recommended the President make that statement, which was as follows, that the President reminded the Joint Chiefs of their basic responsibility to him as their principal military advisors and expressed the hope that their advice would come to him directly and unfiltered. This advice could and should not be purely military, since most of the problems which he was concerned with were shot full of political, economic, and psychological factors, as well as military, and he as president had to take all this into account. His primary complaint against the chiefs with regard to the Bay of Pigs was that he felt, and they had conceded, that they didn't think this was going to work, but they never came in and said so because they weren't asked. The old question of it wasn't put in the mail, hence there was no response. He was dead against that, and I think he was dead right in being against it.
General Brown?
I think it'd be totally unrealistic to try and eliminate all factors but the military. The world is the world, and things go on, and it's just impossible to not. It would be totally unrealistic. In addition to which, the organization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is represented and participates fully in all of the subcommittee work of the National Security Council. The chairman participates actively as a member of the principal subcommittees, and they deal with everything affecting national security, which is foreign policy, economic matters, psychological matters, and he's as exposed to that on a daily basis as most people in government across the board.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Tarr? No? I concur. Can I ask our civilian members if they find any problems with a directive to the military to take political affairs into consideration?
Well, I think we have to somewhat qualify what we mean, define our term here, political factors. I think it's, as General Taylor suggests, to take into appropriate consideration the complexity of global factors and consideration and making enlightened military advice. It's really essential. I think the prestige and the integrity and the reputation of the services, it's essential to keep them insulated and immunized as much as possible politically. And this can't be done in a pure sense, but I think in my experience, this has been more a problem on the civilian political side than on the chief side, where I think presidents in the past have misused the military, oftentimes to defend unpopular policies or to be pushed out front on controversial issues.
John, I agree with what the senator said, but I do think you have to point out that when you ask a really able man for advice, you can't compartmentalize it and say, now you just give me a part of this, because if he's got a good mind, he's going to look at the whole problem.
General Taylor?
I agree with that. The word political gets us into trouble.
Yeah.
But political, as we all know, it doesn't mean not necessarily pertaining to political parties, but it also means pertaining to policy, to polity. And in that sense, the Joint Chiefs have very much of an interest, a legitimate interest in it. Let me just quote President Kennedy on this point that we were talking about. He says, "While I look to the chiefs to present the military factor without reserve or hesitation, I regard them to be more than military men and expect their help in fitting military requirements into the overall context of any situation, recognizing that the most difficult problem in government is to combine all assets in a unified, effective pattern."
Well, I would suggest that you have, gentlemen, in your dialogue open very wide all of the areas of potential question and answer seeking in the role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in national policy, and it's time to go to the question and answer session. Now, may I have the first question, please? Sir?
I'm General J. Lawton Collins, retired, former Chief of Staff of the Army during the period of the Korean War from 49 to 53. My question has to do with the manner in which the Joint Chiefs of Staff follow up, if they do follow up, on any instructions that are issued to the unified commanders or specified commanders in the field. My understanding is that the system of having an executive agent for each of the theaters of operations, an executive agent, a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who would follow up on what is going on in the theater, that system has been done away with. To me, it was a very valuable system. I wonder what they've done to replace it.
All right, sir. Would General Brown, would you like to tackle that first?
Well, for time, General Collins, as you perhaps know, there was an Inspector General function set up within the Unified Command structure. It's still there in part, but principally it serves the Commander-in-Chief of the specific theater. I must say that the follow-up is not done in any formal or organized manner, and it was not that function, as I understand it. I did not live as a member of the Chiefs when the executive agent business came to a stop, but I think now that the commanders-in-chief of the unified commands are truly unified and not oriented principally toward one of the military departments, and I think that's a plus. The follow-up on programs and actions is done still by the services because they have the resources and they have the administrative functions that support the SINCs. So the SINC is powerless to do anything unless the service provides the wherewithal.
And I might add for the lay listeners that SINCS is a commander-in-chief in the specified area. May we have the next question, please? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm Pat Holt, former staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I noticed that General Brown, in his initial presentation, referred to the fact that he had served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs under Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter, which I think makes him unique in serving in this position under three presidents. And he also mentioned the fact that there were differences between what these presidents wanted. And I would like him to elaborate upon these differences. And in that same connection, if time permits, although General Taylor did not serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs under all this many presidents, he did serve as Chief of Staff and as chairman under more than one, and I wonder if he'd like to comment on that too.
General Brown?
Well, I think the first point to acknowledge is that the period of time in which I served as chairman when President Nixon was in office, he had his mind on other matters, and the national security affairs were pretty well moved along existing policy and carried on with the momentum that they had gained. With President Ford, he used the National Security Council frequently and regularly in formal session, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were represented at each and every one of those meetings and were expected to participate fully in the discussions, either I or the acting chairman. But President Carter, starting from the time following the election and prior to the inauguration, we have had even more extensive personal intercourse with President Carter than I think the Joint Chiefs of Staff have had with any president in history. But the actual business that's conducted currently is carried out more actively within the substructure of the National Security Council system than with the principal body. And therefore, our exposure to the President on a routine basis on these policy questions is perhaps less extensive than it was with President Ford. Although in actual hours, we've spent more time with President Carter, I think, this group of chiefs, than any president has spent with the Joint Chiefs. He's quite proud of it, as a matter of fact.
General Taylor, will you talk about your experience as Chief of Staff, Army, and Chairman Joint Chiefs?
Well, as Chief of Staff of the Army, I was under President Eisenhower, who was a close friend of mine from the war, a deep affection for President Eisenhower. He fitted into his job well. He understood organization. The National Security Council was his dish of cherries because it's just like his staff at SHAPE. He understood staff work, and so he was comfortable in the whole atmosphere of the business. However, he wanted to detach himself as much as possible from the military aspect of this because of his fact he had a military past. He did not want to identify himself as a military president. And hence, I would say the Pentagon got less attention from the president under President Eisenhower than under President Kennedy or President Johnson. The latter two were entirely different men in personality, character, and so on. Yet two things they had in common, and I would say probably true of most presidents. First, they did not believe in an open administration. They had no sympathy with the idea of opening the doors of the White House and the National Security Council and talking about things. As a matter of fact, both President Kennedy and President Johnson found the National Security Council so large that nothing was done there except to ratify things that had been decided in the Oval Room long before. I think that's probably the way the National Security Council should be used, although that's not quite the way the Founding Fathers intended. Secondly, both of these men certainly did not want yes men around them. This business of getting the president isolated within cronies that talk just one language, that may happen sometimes, but not with these two men. They went out of their way to find dissenting voices in their own group and then expected them to be loyal and keep their damn mouths shut until the decision had been made, and then continue to keep their mouths shut.
All right, next question on this side, please. Yes.
My name is Cy K. Meyer with the Marine Corps League. Earlier, on the one hand, President Carter's ordered Stedman report states the JCS plays a limited role and the entire system needs overhaul. Dr. Tarr stated very profoundly that the flexibility is already there. The role of General Marshall, Admiral King, and Admiral Leahy on President Roosevelt's immediate staff was also mentioned as being important. We saw the role General Haig played during a crucial period of the Nixon administration. What military officer or staff member now participates on the immediate staff of the President? And isn't this important to the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Mm-hmm. General Taylor?
I was recalled from civil life after the Bay of Pigs and taken into the White House in a role such as the one that you described. There was a great debate on how to describe the job, and they ended up with this gobbledygook, the military representative of the President. And I spent almost a year and a half there. My presence was a cause of no enjoyment in the Pentagon. The Joint Chiefs were some of my best friends. The chairman was a very particularly close friend. We talked about the job, and I always said I can beat you all hollow. My advice is nearly as good as yours, but it'll be on time, and yours will be 3 weeks late. But when I was chosen by the president to become chairman in 1962, asked me about, oh, by the way, whom do you recommend to fill your job? I said, nobody. Never have anybody like that around the White House again.
Would you develop that? So why never again?
Because the chairman of the Joint Chiefs should fill that job. He should be close enough to the president. He's handicapped by the distance between the White House and the Pentagon. The Potomac isn't really very wide, but it certainly separates people in very curious ways that I discovered. But nonetheless, in spite of that handicap, he ought to be on the terms that the president wants him to pick up the telephone and call him when he wants to talk to him, tell the Secretary of Defense, obviously. But in the ideal case, the chairman would do everything that he's supposed to do, and also this role in the White House. There are always the aides in the White House, and their value, how they're used, let's put it that way, depends on the president. Some have been quite influential, some have simply been for social function. So there again, I think it's the need of the president. The reason I was taken there is because the president, a new president, felt alone after the Bay of Pigs, and he wanted an outsider. He just happened to call me in. When that went away, there was no need for it, and I don't think there's been any need any time since for a senior position of that heart.
Right. Next question, please, on this side. Yeah. Yes.
My name is John Dring. I'm legislative assistant to Congressman Robin Beard, who's a member of the House Armed Services Committee. General Brown, it's becoming more apparent that budgetary and political considerations are playing a greater and greater part in major defense policy decisions. As such, it appears that the JCS is losing influence to OMB and the Secretary of Defense. Examples of this would include recent executive branch decisions on cancellations of the B-1 bomber, withdrawal of U.S. troops from Korea, and implementation of a new planning, programming, budgeting system for the defense budget, which puts the tighter political control over the decision-making process at a level which heretofore had been reserved for the military. My question is this your perception? And if so, what can be done to reverse the trend?
You've got a lot wrapped up there in one question. I don't have that perception. I'm not aware that the planning, programming, and budgeting system has been amended to remove the military side of the team from the act. I think they're very much involved. The anonymity of the OMB to the Congress, I know is a burr under their saddle, but I can't solve that problem, and I don't think that's what we're here to talk about. The B-1 was handled in a different manner. There's no question about it. But the chiefs did get to see and comment on a study done by the Secretary of Defense, or at his behest, and we offered comments and criticism of that study, which incidentally was very even-handed. It proved nothing. You could argue either side of the question from the study. And we gave our views to the president, even though that they, without waiting to be asked, in March and again in June. The other issues that you mentioned, we have had a voice in and gave advice.
Yes, please, Senator.
The B-1 decision turned on cost because there was a judgment by the highest civilian authority that there was a more cost-effective way to carry out the same mission. You may disagree with that judgment, but that was a judgment. And as far as Korean troop withdrawal, that's a foreign policy decision. It isn't. No one's doing that on the basis of cost savings, because if you don't bring those troops back and demobilize them, it's cheaper to keep them over there. So no one's doing that on the basis of saving money. There may be other reasons. Finally, I think it's very important to keep in mind that when we talk about security, we're talking about more than just defense. We're talking about the health of the economy of this country. If you got an army of 7 million unemployed people, it doesn't scare anybody too much. We're talking about the continued viability and strength of that economy. We talk about the welfare of the people. We talk about their morale. And we talk about their confidence in the political institutions of this nation. So you could spend, it isn't how much we spend on defense, it's what we buy and whether we get what we pay for. Soviets spend 6 times as much as we do on agriculture, and I wouldn't trade with them.
Next question. Jesse, you go.
I'm Tom Wolf of the RAND Corporation. I have a question that pertains to the relationship between the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense. And it's in two parts. One's general, one's specific. Maybe the general part can be for General Brown. And that is, in the case when the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense may not agree on some important issue of national policy, does that create real problems, and how and where does it get resolved? And the second part of my question, the specific part, is that should the Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense not see eye to eye on a SALT agreement, which the administration wants the Congress to ratify, how is this going to affect the consideration of ratification in the Congress, in the Senate particularly?
Well, on the first, the differences of view between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense are resolved between the two, if it can be. If not, it's conceivable that both, that is, the Secretary and the Chairman representing the Chiefs, would take it before the President. In my 4 years, that happened once. Or it's conceivable that a paper would be drawn up, and more likely expressing both views, and that would be forwarded to the President. And again, it depends on the issue, the seriousness of it, and how strongly held the views are. It could be that the Chiefs are prepared on an issue to accept a decision by the Secretary of Defense, and even though it goes against them, because it, in the final analysis, doesn't affect the security of the country that much that they want to take the President's time to go over there and debate it before him. But so it would depend on the issue, I think, Tom.
Yes, would you, Senator?
I think that the thing to keep in mind is that the President is charged as the ultimate decision maker under our constitutional system, the Commander-in-Chief, to make these foreign policy judgments, obviously based on the best military assessments that he can obtain, and properly from the Chiefs. Now, it seems to me that the Chiefs must be free to render military judgments, never be muzzled, be able to speak out, responsibly speak out, but cautious, I think, enough to avoid letting their views be used by those people who would desire to subvert a policy which properly should take into account non-military considerations. Now, I think, practically speaking, it's rather unrealistic to contemplate that the Congress would view favorably and the Senate would ratify a treaty where the formal position of the Joint Chiefs was not, at a minimum, that this agreement would not adversely affect the strategic balance. It's inconceivable to me that any president would even take it up to the Hill.
All right, the final question, please.
My name is General Dick Stilwell. In the military, sir, the discipline is the sine qua non of everything. We make recommendations, decisions are taken, we carry them out. But there are limits. They apply all the way up and down the line. Now, there are some who felt that the Joint Chiefs of Staff collectively should have retired en masse in July of 1965, when our Commander-in-Chief failed to mobilize this country attitudinally and physically for a war whose parameters most of us didn't understand, but certainly required that if it was to be fought to a successful conclusion. Do the panelists agree that there are issues which would demand or dictate that the Joint Chiefs stand up and turn in their suits because of decisions taken or pending inimical to the national security, such as the SALT negotiations?
General Taylor?
That's very easy to answer. There certainly are some situations which they arose would lead a member of the Joint Chiefs to turn in his suit. I could think of a few that never arose on my occasion. However, I took such a buffeting for 4 years, I was very glad to turn in my seat peacefully when it was all over. On the points you raised, however, I was not wearing the uniform on the question of mobilization or not. I recommended it as an advisor to President Johnson. I didn't expect General Wheeler to resign, however, because when he didn't get it, because it was a very touchy question, one in which I could make an awfully good case for both sides, in which the military had a strong interest, but the overall interest was political in a high sense of the relationship of our country internationally. And hence, I took that decision and would have taken it in uniform regretfully, but recognizing that the man with the greatest responsibility had the right to make the decision.
General Brown?
I would add one point, Dick. I personally had never defined that sort of thing. In other words, I didn't toe a line on the ground and say one step over that, and because in my mind it was more of a general conclusion that I was perfectly prepared to do it. As I told the Congress on 3 occasions, House of Representatives, the Armed Services Committee, but to do it, I had to ask myself, what good would it do? Would it cause would it reverse the decision? And the answer I always came up with was no, not a bit of it. It was like another pebble on the beach. They'd have another chairman tomorrow and everybody would forget Brown in 2 days, you know. That's the way the world goes. Now, on the other hand, I think if a situation so direly threatened the national security interest, it wouldn't be necessary, because I think you'd find a voice in the Congress before the appropriate committees. It takes no doing to get invited over there to testify. If the issue is serious and recognized as serious by the chairman and his staff. And the same thing I must say at the White House. So I just don't see the issue ever rise. And then there's always that other feeling that you shrug and say, well, maybe if I stay around and work at it hard enough, long enough, we'll get this thing reversed.
All right, this concludes another public policy forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research.
This public policy forum on the role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has brought you the views of 4 experts on the subject. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.